There's a moment I tell my audience, palms open, voice steady. A moment when silence becomes louder than 1,000 arguments. And when you didn't react, his whole world started falling apart. For 10 seconds, I let that truth vibrate in the air like a quiet bell. Because silence isn't empty. Silence is power wearing a velvet coat. I say, you didn't withhold a reaction to punish him. You simply chose yourself. You chose clarity. You chose dignity. And that choice unsettled him in a way your tears never could. Because people who rely on your emotional responses to anchor their ego suddenly feel lost when you stop feeding them your energy. Your silence became a mirror he couldn't run from. And mirrors are frightening for people who've been hiding from their own reflection. When you didn't react, I continue, realize something terrifying. He no longer controlled the emotional weather in your life. He couldn't provoke you. He couldn't define you. He couldn't pull strings you'd already untied. You became unreadable, unreachable, untouchable. And that is where his unraveling began. Inside him, a quiet panic bloomed. What if he wasn't as important as he believed? What if you were stronger than he ever imagined? What if your silence meant you finally saw through everything he tried to mask? Your stillness didn't break him. It revealed he was already cracking. There's something profoundly unsettling about being faced with the truth of your own behavior, especially when it's delivered without accusation, without argument, without emotional fireworks. When you didn't react, you didn't just fall silent, you held up a mirror. And suddenly, all the excuses he had been using to justify his actions evaporated. Your silence stripped away the noise he used to hide behind. No defensive explanations, no emotional back and forth, no dramatic cycle he could pull you into, just truth, just distance, just the weight of his own choices. I tell my audience, silence is honest. It reveals what words try to cover, and in that honesty, he found himself completely exposed. Because as long as you reacted, he could blame your reaction, but when you didn't, he had to face what caused it. That's when the cracks inside him widened. He began replaying every conversation in his head. Every moment he dismissed your feelings, every time he took your presence for granted, every instance he assumed he'd always have access to your heart. Now, without your reactions cushioning his ego, he felt the truth like a cold wind on uncovered skin. It wasn't just that you stopped responding, it's that your silence meant something deeper. You finally understood your worth. You stopped negotiating with disrespect. You stepped out of the emotional arena entirely. And he realized, maybe for the first time, that your absence held more strength than your presence ever revealed. There's a particular moment, so subtle most people miss it, when someone realizes they no longer have a guaranteed place in your life. And for him, that moment came the instant you didn't react. It wasn't just silence, it was distance. A distance he didn't know how to cross anymore. I tell my audience, people who depend on your emotional responses panic when you stop handing them the map to your heart because your reactions used to guide him. They told him where he stood. They reassured him that no matter how messy things became, you were still emotionally invested. But when you stopped reacting, you removed the emotional GPS he relied on. Suddenly he was standing in the middle of uncertainty, and uncertainty terrifies people who never expected to lose you. He felt you slipping slowly, quietly, deliberately. And the frightening part wasn't that you walked away loudly. It was that you didn't. You simply stopped meeting him where the pain lived. You stopped fixing the things he broke. Stopped carrying the weight he conveniently handed you. Stopped letting his moods dictate your peace. And that silence wasn't emptiness. It was liberation. He sensed something he had never felt before. You were no longer trying. You were no longer bending. You were no longer shrinking yourself to keep the connection alive. Your quiet detachment became the loudest warning he had ever heard. Because when a woman stops reacting, she's not giving up, she's outgrowing. And that realization shook him more than any argument ever could. There's a specific kind of person who thrives on your reactions, not because they want connection, but because they want control. And when you didn't react, that entire structure he built, the one where he felt powerful only when you were emotional, began to collapse beneath him. I tell my audience, some people don't fear losing you. They fear losing the version of you that tolerated what never deserved tolerance. Your silence meant that version of you was gone. He felt it instantly, the shift, the detachment, the calm that wasn't passive but intentional. He could no longer pull your emotional strings. He could no longer provoke you into arguments that fed his ego. He could no longer rely on your heart to soften the consequences of his choices. Your stillness dismantled the illusion that he held any power over your emotional landscape. Suddenly, he was left with the one thing he never wanted to face himself: his actions, his patterns, his behavior without your reactions to dilute the impact. For the first time, he had to experience the full weight of his own emotional immaturity. And it terrified him because people who control through chaos need your participation. They need your confusion. They need your emotional energy as fuel. But when you stepped out of that dynamic, quietly, gracefully, firmly, his foundation crumbled. He realized your silence didn't mean defeat. It meant clarity. It meant boundaries. It meant he could no longer hide behind your reactions. And in that moment, the power shifted entirely back to you. There's a moment when silence stops being a reaction and becomes a revelation. And when you didn't react, he was forced to confront something he had avoided for far too long, the pain he caused. Not the exaggerated version he convinced himself you felt, not the minimized version he justified, but the real, raw wound he left behind. I tell my audience, silence is not the absence of emotion. It is the presence of truth. And in that truth, he finally saw everything he had ignored. Your silence highlighted every broken promise he brushed aside, every dismissive comment he pretended didn't matter, every time he made you feel small and expected you to bounce back as if hurt had limits. Without your reactions shielding him, he saw the full impact of his behavior, and the weight of that realization hit him in ways he never anticipated. He replayed moments where he should have listened but didn't, where he should have apologized but blamed you instead, where he should have stayed present but chose convenience. Your silence became the echo of consequences he once believed he'd never face. What shook him wasn't just that you went quiet. It was that your quiet wasn't rooted in anger anymore. It was rooted in clarity. Clarity that said, I'm done explaining pain you refuse to acknowledge. Clarity that said, I'm healing myself because you never tried to understand me. And he realized with a sinking kind of honesty that the wound he caused didn't just change you, it ended the version of you who tolerated him. There comes a point when someone who once felt secure in your presence suddenly feels the weight of uncertainty pressing against their chest. And for him, that fear arrived the moment you didn't react. It was subtle at first, a quiet discomfort, a tightening inside his chest, but it grew quickly because losing your reactions felt dangerously close to losing you. I tell my audience, people don't fear your silence. They fear what your silence means. And what your silence meant was this: you were no longer reachable in the ways he counted on, no longer predictable, no longer emotionally available on demand. He felt the bond shifting, not because you said anything, but because you didn't. That space between you, once filled with your effort, your empathy, your attempts to make things work, became empty. And he could feel himself standing on the edge of a loss he never believed was possible. He wondered if you were detaching. He wondered if you were healing. He wondered if you were finally realizing you deserved better. That fear wasn't rooted in love alone. It was rooted in the realization that he had taken the very person he needed the most for granted. Your silence made him question everything. Was this the beginning of the end? Had he pushed too far? Was he now the only one fighting for a connection he once assumed was guaranteed? For the first time, he understood the gravity of what he could lose. And it wasn't your anger he feared, it was your indifference. There's a shift so profound it doesn't need to be announced, explained, or justified. It shows itself in the way you stop chasing, stop explaining, stop over giving. And when you didn't react, He felt that shift like a door quietly closing, one he never imagined you'd have the strength to shut. I tell my audience, healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, I'm done hurting in the same place. Your silence wasn't coldness. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was transformation. He watched you pull your energy inward instead of spilling it everywhere to fix what was never yours to fix. He saw you tending to your peace, choosing solitude over chaos, choosing clarity over confusion. And that terrified him more than any argument ever could, because healing meant you were no longer emotionally dependent on him. It meant his validation was no longer your oxygen. It meant the cycle he relied on. Hurt, react, repair was broken. You were no longer revolving around his moods. You were no longer defining your worth by his inconsistency. You were no longer trying to be enough for someone who didn't know how to receive you. And the truth hit him hard. You were healing in places he never bothered to understand. You were growing in directions he never tried to support. You were becoming someone who might never look back. Your silence revealed that your heart was stitching itself back together, and that process didn't include him anymore. There's a truth many people never admit out loud. Not everyone wants you healed. Not everyone wants you strong. Some people only feel secure when you're doubting yourself, shrinking yourself, or trying endlessly to prove your worth. And when you didn't react, he felt something he never expected. Your growth, your self-respect, your awakening. I tell my audience, your growth will intimidate those who benefited from your lack of it. And that's exactly what happened. Your silence signaled evolution. It signaled that you were breaking out of patterns he depended on. It signaled that you were becoming someone he could no longer manipulate or emotionally anchor. He wasn't ready for that version of you. The version who didn't explain herself. The version who didn't justify her boundaries. The version who no longer needed his approval to breathe. Your growth confronted him with a truth he had been avoiding. His power over you was never real. It was borrowed. Borrowed from your empathy, borrowed from your love, borrowed from your willingness to try. But when you started rising, he felt himself shrinking, because people who thrive on imbalance can't survive when you finally stand tall. Your silence wasn't emptiness. It was evolution happening in real time. It showed him you were stepping into a version of yourself he couldn't control, couldn't predict, and couldn't minimize. And as you expanded, he felt smaller, not because you diminished him, but because he never grew with you. Your growth was never the problem. His ego was. There's a moment, quiet but undeniable, when someone finally understands that they didn't just lose your reaction, they lost access to the version of you they depended on. And the moment you didn't react, he felt the shift in his bones. Not the dramatic kind, not the explosive kind, the irreversible kind. I tell my audience, silence isn't distance. Silence is evolution. And he felt that evolution happening in real time. Your silence wasn't temporary. It wasn't a phase. It wasn't one of those moments where you'd pull back for a little while and then return, trying even harder to be understood, valued, or chosen. This time, you weren't collapsing inward. You were unfolding, becoming, stepping into a version of yourself shaped by clarity instead of chaos. He started sensing it in the way you moved, the way you spoke, the way you simply existed. There was a steadiness in you he wasn't used to, a confidence that didn't require his approval, a peace that didn't rely on his presence. And that's when the truth hit him with full force. Even if he apologized, even if he tried to fix things, even if he showed up better, you were never going to return as the same version of yourself he once knew. He realized you didn't break, you transformed. And no matter what he did now, he couldn't pull you back into who you used to be. Your silence showed him that you weren't waiting, you weren't hoping, you weren't circling back, you were changing. And change is the one thing he never prepared for. And now we arrive at the final truthy. Your silence wasn't absence. It wasn't emptiness. It was a declaration, a statement louder than any argument, any fight, any tear. When you didn't react, his entire world started falling apart. not because you intended to hurt him, but because you finally stopped giving him the power to define your reality. I tell my audience, the most courageous thing you can do is to step into your own life fully, even when someone else wants to see you small. Your silence carried the weight of your boundaries. It carried the depth of your self-respect. It carried a clarity that he had never confronted before. He realized he could no longer manipulate, provoke, or control you. He realized that your peace was not a tool for him to exploit. He realized painfully that the version of you he once relied on no longer existed. And in that realization, his world crumbled, not because you attacked, not because you retaliated, but because you became untouchable in your authenticity. Your non-reaction showed him something undeniable. You are whole, you are strong, you are unstoppable. You didn't react, and in doing so, you demonstrated a truth he could never argue against. Some women's power is not loud. It's quiet, unshakable, and transformative. Some women's strength isn't in how they fight. It's in how they refuse to be pulled into chaos. Some women's silence is not absence. It's the sound of their own liberation. And that liberation, that unstoppable, unwavering, unapologetic liberation, was the moment he realized the full measure of what he had lost.